So you've been feeling kind of down. Last session, we talked a lot about your kind of holding on to your resentment and anger towards your father, and the importance that if you want to release yourself from all that baggage, you got to release yourself from the resentment, right? All that. And the only way to do that is to forgive. And how do you forgive is through compassion, right?
Yeah.
So how have you been since then?
You got real quiet on me there.
Oh, I did. I said how.
There you go. That's better.
How have you been since then? Our session.
I've been good. I did call him afterwards because we had that little awkward discussion about lending him money, and I didn't want it to go like a week or so without talking to him. Then he might think I was mad that he asked me, and
yeah.
So, and you said just kind of give him a call and follow through, and I just acted normal, like everything was. I didn't even bring it up. I just, hey, how you doing? So it was good because I think it made him realize I wasn't mad at him either. So.
Yeah, and that. Oh my God! Hold on a second, Gianna. No, not right now. Sorry. Dog toy. Okay. That's awesome, and it wasn't that big of a deal.
Right.
And do you see how easy that was?
Yes.
Just to, well, and you kind of had to forgive him for asking, but at the same time, just imagine how hard it would have been for him to ask. It had to have been somewhat hard, but.
Right.
And then to get rejected.
Right.
So to follow through like that was very sweet and loving.
Yeah, because I didn't want him to feel either that I was mad about it. Because I'm not mad about it. I just get confused and.
Well, you resent it.
Right.
Because you're bringing a bunch of your childhood baggage into it.
Right.
And so it's kind of like, it's really important you reconcile that baggage.
Right.
Even if it's still occurring currently, you have to understand your father from now, from grace, from compassion, from seeing him as an individual, not as a failure as a father. You have to really recontextualize how you relate to him, and you have to make it so that it doesn't require he change. Right? Because if it requires he change, you are going to be miserable forever. Right?
Right. Right.
Plus,
that's exactly it. My expectations are always.
Oh, expectations. That's like the devil's work right there, isn't it? It is. It's like anytime you create expectations for other people and yourself outside of reality based on some fantasy coming from your survival need for whatever overreach, you're going to be disappointed and everything sucks, and it's like automatically positioned in victim mode,
Well, it's funny because I've often said to people, and I don't even remember what it's been about, I guess but I'll say this to people sometimes and look at me. I'd say it, but I wasn't really even following my own advice that if you have no expectations, you won't get hurt.
No, it's actually very true, because to not have expectations, you have to be open-minded. And you have to, again, the other thing you have to really think about, what does it take to not have expectations? It really takes that you aren't, in the situation at hand, you aren't reliant on the outcome. That your well-being or your safety or your security or your survival, right? Those survival needs that we all have, hardwired through millions of years of evolution, that we don't rely on rely on something outside of ourselves to soothe and to calm those needs. I remember, I don't know if I can describe this very well. I'll do the best I can. There was a part of my out-of-body experience, or near death, I don't know what to think of it, was the awareness that there were things in my psyche or in my soul that were not fulfilled. There was a void. It always felt like a hole, a need, like a black hole. that was just dark, and it was sucking everything into it. It just felt like it needed to be closed up or filled. And I became aware that I was looking to other people to fill it for me. Not in a I am entitled type of way. Some people do use entitlement, but for me it was a need. I need someone to give me that feeling of safety or fulfill that little void or that vortex or black hole, whatever you want to call it. And I became aware that I had to fulfill that the only way for it to actually go away permanently was to fulfill it myself, to somehow find within myself, without the awareness of the strength or ability, the ability to fill that void. The other thing that I became aware of, and that's what you and I are describing right now, is that you had the same void. You had one of those black holes, and your dad was the one you wanted to fill it, and he wasn't filling it for you. In fact, he wanted you to probably fill his void, in terms of like,
could be.
But you learn too, I learned in that moment that no one knows what that is. No one knows when it appears. No one knows how deep, how wide, how large, how the viscosity of what needs to, no one really understands it or experiences it except for me. And so to expect someone else to be outside of my consciousness and outside of my awareness to know that's what I need and to fulfill that for me, that's like enslaving someone else, so it became something very important to my recovery. Was that moment that I realized I cannot rely on any other person, structure, system to fulfill those things for me, because no one else is aware of what that is, what's the cause, and what's the solution. I have to be aware in the moment it appears what it is, how it works, and how it's going to get solved, and I have to take responsibility. This is huge, Julie.
Oh yeah, because it's not really fair to expect that someone else can read your mind and know exactly what you need, and then penalize them for not knowing.
Correct. Well, and it's understandable with a child, because as children, our parents just naturally take care of what we need, right? Like, I'm hungry, they bring us food. So there's this reliance, I think, on our parents for good reason to take care of us, and there's a point where we have to break from the need of these very important relationships, primally important relationships with our tribe, our parents, our siblings, our best friends, the people that we rely on their safety and the safe environment with them to develop. And so if you aren't feeling safe with your own parents or fulfilled by your own parents, you can get stuck in a very childish position of victim mentality. And victim mentality is absolutely childish, because you're, in essence, to create that victim position, you have to be incapable, and you are relying on someone else's capability. You're not taking responsibility. It's someone else's responsibility, whether it's the government's responsibility, your church's responsibility, the teacher's responsibility, the students. You can go of layers and layers and layers of, the neighborhood's responsibility. When you position yourself as a victim, you are powerless and you are not taking responsibility, or you are trying to push the responsibility onto other people, right? And that's not always a bad thing. I'm not saying that's always a bad thing. It's just there comes a point where it is harming yourself to not take responsibility. And even if, that's a great conversation we could spend a good hour talking about, is the importance in recovery of taking full and complete responsibility for yourself. And one of the things I had to do was accept responsibility and take it away from religion, take it away from my siblings, my parents. I had to remove responsibility from them. That was very hard because in a way, giving them responsibility does feel like love. So it can come across as disconnecting from your family when in reality it's not disconnection at all. It just opens you up to what we can call unconditional love. It's removing the conditions. The vulnerability when you've been raised or brought up, or that's all you understand, are conditional aspects of what love is, which is actually dependency and neediness and whatever that is. But it is that you open yourself up to the vulnerability of allowing people to be themselves and requiring of yourself to adapt to that person. That if you truly love and care about your father, for example, and for me it was my husband at the time, I will allow him to be himself. I do not need to require him to be Mormon or Catholic or Jewish or whatever religion you are for you to love them. I realized that I was enforcing this religion onto him out of my own fear of rejection and abandonment by my parents. It had nothing to do with me. It was ultimately coming from conditional love from my parents around the religion we were raised in, right? So can you see any of that in your own kind of history around the conditions you held for your father, the expectations, and how those, maybe there were expectations placed on you to create?
Oh yeah, I can see it. And I can also see how I almost carry that over with my marriage, expecting my husband to fulfill these voids, and he has no freaking clue that they're
no, and it's kind of mean to do that to someone,
right? But now I didn't see it as mean. I thought
it was quote
being
unquote
my
love.
partner, he should just know. But now I know that that's not true.
No, and that's needy and irresponsible, but you don't see that until you see it.
Right.
And then you're like, oh my God, it's time to grow up. It's time to...
Well, that's what it is. I don't feel like it was malicious, like you said, just being demanding or high maintenance, just, I don't know.
Well, I think it's an illusion of love, don't you think? To be demanding and to be... It's just an artificial form of love. Surface oriented, like if I require him to do this, that means I need him. Neediness is lovingness. It's just an artificial form of, or an illusion of love, when it's actually just neediness.
Right, and I guess it was me needing him to prove to me that he loved me. It's just kind of...
Exactly, it goes both directions. So the same thing, the same relationship is what you were doing with your body. I need my body to be this image so that I can love it. And that means that it is supplying me what I need. So go back to what I said about me trying to enforce this religious ideology onto my husband because I needed it to feel secure with my family. And so when he was just like, no, I'm not going to do that. It would really put me in a position to question, do I really love him? And do I really love
me if he's not willing to do this?
Well, yeah, I have letters from that period of time in my life. At some point, this might be part of my own biography or whatever I want to do with it. But where I was saying to him, he did not care about me because he was not willing. And I was reading it now, 20 years later, and hearing that I was absolutely judging him for not, I was the one.
Right.
He loved me unconditionally. He was fine if I wanted to stay in that religion. He loved me unconditionally. It wasn't him. It was me projecting that onto him, but I was the one actually being that way.
Yeah.
And it was, and I had to really look at, is this religion worth it? Do I really love it? Well, and that came after nearing suicide, was that I would never want to do this again in my life. As I was reconciling, I realized this was not me. It wasn't real. It was artificial. It was indoctrinated. I hated it. I loathed it. I didn't want anything to do with it. And that if I got another chance, I would never attach myself to something so controlling ever again. But anyways, back to this idea of, going into the vulnerability of taking responsibility for yourself, is it can feel vulnerable because by having these controls, it gives you a sense of boundaries, and it's like a diet. It gives me a sense of order that I can rely on it's like an environment that I can look at to make sure it's safe. Right? It's like holding on or grasping onto these edges to tell me if I'm safe. And so to let those edges go and those controls go and that expectations go, you're relying on yourself to feel safe. You have to rely on your discernment of people rather than, do they drink? How are they dressed? What do they look like? What type of language are they using? I mean, all of those brainwashed programs, you're basically getting rid of the programming to rely on your discernment. For me, it was very difficult because after I went into reality outside of a very controlled, isolated, vacuumed environment of perfection growing up, where I was never really allowed to socialize in certain environments, I was really kind of removed from reality. When I went into reality, because I was so removed, I had no discernment of people and no social development. I was socially extremely immature. But you don't know that until you get into reality and you realize, wow, how do people know all these things? And I have no idea and concepts, and I'm getting abused. So I had to rely on my discernment after being abused and traumatized in reality. It was intense. My recovery was intense, but in a way, every client I work with is having to do the same thing. Not necessarily from the same angle and the same amount and the same... But you could say the equation or the method for everybody is exactly the same. Taking responsibility. That's the same for everybody. How much responsibility? That's unique, right? And in what direction? For me, it was responsibility for defining my worth as a human before I relied on your family's feedback and the religious feedback. The religious ideology and rules and dogma was my feedback, So without that, I had to rely on myself, and relying on people's feedback. So I think that feedback to know your value is actually beneficial to some degree and harmful, massively harmful when you get to a certain point. Getting feedback from, like, I'm giving my feedback to my children right now, right? Because I got to help them integrate into reality. So I give them feedback. You can't be like this. You can't treat people that way. And that can come across as criticism, right? So they can take it how they want. But getting that feedback is important. It's just maintaining a sense of autonomy and responsibility for who you are, how you make choices, fulfilling your needs from within, rather than trying to fulfill them outside of yourself. This brings me to, I think, just kind of an expansion of this topic, Julie, which is, if you are not fulfilling those needs within yourself, you are inherently going to be in fight or flight permanently until you do. I believe that the only way to really calm and soothe this survival need to feel lovable and to feel loved by your pack and your community is to fulfill it from within yourself, that I am lovable, and to make it unconditional. If it has conditions, the ease and safety and pleasure you get from it is super conditional. You can feel better. You can have that sense of, oh, I feel free, but it's like super conditional. So it requires a form of slavery or work to maintain it, to keep it, to chase it. That's kind of like the thin supremacy. You can have fleeting moments of euphoria, but it's so fleeting. Right? It is euphoric. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, yeah.
It's enough to keep you chasing it, obsessed. It's a trap. But it's so conditional. The conditions are extreme and it's only fleeting. So because it's dependent. Again, not taking responsibility, putting the responsibility on a condition of the body. Similar to putting it on the condition of your husband, the condition of your relationship with God based in religion. What type of length do you have to go to feel that connected? So if you can connect within your authentic self, it's like you live in it. You don't have to go to some strange length to access it temporarily. Am I making any sense?
Oh yeah, you make a lot of sense.
Okay, well, if I'm just rambling.
No, I'm just processing it all. But no, it makes total sense.
Yeah, so you've got to be willing to be vulnerable, to support yourself. It's like really getting back to your nature, I think, as an autonomous individual. It's like that, having liberty as an individual person, liberty to really care for yourself.
Well, I guess too, growing up, taking care of myself, sometimes I was kind of made to feel or told that it was selfish, or you have to think about everybody else.
Well, and there is a balance there. That's true. Don't you agree? To some degree,
yeah.
We kind of have to think of the environment as a whole. However, if it comes down to, let's just say, like your well-being, look at the sacrifice. And if you're being asked to sacrifice really, truly your well-being, your identity, like me, trying to get my, boyfriend at the time to convert to this religion is actually quite abusive. If you think about it, I wanted him to change his identity for me.
Oh yeah.
To go
right.
completely.
And then didn't want to do it.
Well, yeah, because I had an identity, but it wasn't really me. It was an identity of religion. And that became more important than me, and he saw it. But to expect that of him and then tell him because he's not doing it for me, that is selfish. Right? You see how yes. It is selfish, but he's being selfish in a very, very self-protective and honorable way.
Right.
So
sure.
You have to be okay with it being called selfish, or if it is selfish, if it means that it is somewhat taking care of yourself. And if it is in a destructive way, you've got to be gracious around the destruction. There's a balance around how this works, especially when you're trying to coordinate with another human being, right? It's very true.
Yeah, it is a delicate process.
Yeah, like the little things that I do is in terms of like just living with my husband. We clean up after ourselves. We, I know, my office is really, really bad right now. I have stacks of research. I have piles of writing. It's terrible, and I know it drives him nuts. He's a civil engineer who his pen is at a specific angle. His, it's meticulous. And so my office, which is our office right now, I'm disrespecting or being selfish around my piles of shit. Compromise, right? You just have to be know where your boundaries are, and I think that's what has to develop. That's what I had to develop too, or what are my boundaries? So it doesn't really matter what anybody else wants from me if I know my boundaries. And I've got to be willing to be rejected, abandoned, disapproved of, judged, criticized, and disappointing other people. Right? If I am not willing to budge my boundaries anymore. Before, I had no boundaries. I was relying on other people to reinforce my boundaries. Right? Tell me what is right. Tell me what is wrong. Tell me how it should be done. Tell me to what direction, what depth, what angle. And so I gave up essentially my free will. Because I was, I think, inadvertently taught. My parents didn't intend this to happen. But by living to such an intensely dogmatic, controlling environment, essentially my free will was given to that environment. It was given to that church. I don't have free will. The church is going to tell me what to do. It's their will. I will do what they say. I will act and behave based on other people's discernment and connection to God. Not mine, but theirs.
Yeah, well, it all sounds very familiar to me.
Does it?
I wasn't growing up in a real religion. My parents, my mother was pretty religious. My father had no religion at all.
It doesn't have to be religion. It can be anything dogmatic. It can be anything. It can be politics. It can be some idea of education and intelligence. There's a bunch of different systems. It could be money. It could be how to dress. Highly criticized by what you wear. Body image is another system, which is why it's so parallel to all these systems. I've been writing, and I've kind of put in some of this kind of concept of connectivity with God through giving religion your free will. And my editor's just like, I don't know about this, Robin. And I had to explain to her the parallel and the actual research done where people leave religion and go into body image. People go into, recovering from drug addiction or alcohol addiction, going into body image, going into religion, they just bounce around these structures.
So, well, it's pretty easy to cross over because I feel that I'm having that issue now. Not to flip the subject totally, but like spending or hoarding or...
Good. See, this is why we have this conversation. It's like that void or that black hole I was telling you about that I felt I had. If I got rid of this and that, the easy thing would have been to find something else to fill it up with.
Right.
Outside of me. So why it was so relevant in that experience for me was that I became aware in that moment that if I want to recover, I cannot fill it or try to find something else to fill it up with. Because that's kind of what I did as I felt like I was a failure at the religion. When I went into reality and didn't have discernment and ended up being in situations where I didn't have as much power, being assaulted and having terrible traumatic experiences with men, in particular, I felt so ashamed and such a failure at the religious system that I was indoctrinated and identified by. It was so catastrophic to me. Again, it's absolutely distorted into something far worse than it really was, but nonetheless, it was what it was. And so my brain went into a very dark place. And the only way I could feel any redemption wasn't in the religion. It wasn't redeemable. Losing your virginity is not redeemable. You are a chewed piece of gum. And what boy is going to want to chew an already chewed piece of gum? Again, this is like, I don't know how common this is nowadays, but I was part of the X generation being raised by the baby boomer generation and a religious baby, and that was common. A type of fear mongering, around it. They thought it would work. Anyway, so as I felt I had failed one thing, it created that vacuum, right? It created a huge void. And that void was full of shame, failure, hopelessness, loss, pathetic, the dark feelings that I know you know so well that are very much underlying suicide, right? And so my way of fixing it was to go to a new system, which was body image. Because I could at least control that. I'm not being controlled. I'm choosing this. That religion I was born into it. It was not a choice. Even though they say it's a choice, it's never a choice. It was not. Unless you want to be socially shunned and shamed by your family and friends, right? So you see how you can move it around.
Oh yeah. I'm literally moving it around.
Right. So we get rid of body image, which for you really supported your entire identity and motivation in life. What do you work towards in life? Time, focusing, obsessing on diets, entertainment with the binging and all that. And we remove all that, and you kind of have this void that was there to start with, but it's gotten pretty massive over the years. And so it would make sense then to go into finding something else to feel better about yourself. Because if you feel that you have failed body image, right, and we go through a process of getting out of it, if you don't reconcile the failure or the feeling that I suck, I'm a failure, I'm a piece of shit, that is underneath it all, and that I'm not capable without something else, that's huge right there. I'm not capable without something else. I need something else. That you can't do it on your own. That's the moment that is super important in recovery, which is where you take responsibility, even if you don't feel like you can handle it, right? But if you don't take responsibility, you're going to start looking at those other consumerism, right? That's another structure. Money, buying power, flaunt, order, cleaning. That's a real common one too. Working and cleaning and working and cleaning. I can feel better about myself if I become really successful at work. So I may be fat and a big loser and I failed, whoop-de-doo, I'm over it now, but I got to find something else.
Well, I don't want it to go. I was struggling with some issues with drinking a few years ago, and I've kind of pushed them aside. So I guess I'm fearful that I'm going to turn back to that, and I don't want to.
Well, the fact that you're aware of that's a sign you're not going to.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, you're aware. If you weren't aware of that transfer, you'd probably do it. Do you see that? The fact that you're like, oh, I don't want that. I know the consequences. I don't want to go there. What's the likelihood you're going to do that, being that you don't have the wanting of that? Do you not?
Right. The fear will keep me away from it. But it's...
Yeah, that's a healthy dose of fear right there. That's not a good place to go. I'm afraid of that. Then don't go there.
Right.
So you have to go underneath, well, why? Go deeper. Why? What is it that you want to fill the void? What is it outside of yourself why do you need it? What is it that you're not doing for yourself that you would need to rely on a medication or an artificial form of medication to function?
You ask tough questions.
Well, that's because you paid me to do this.
No, tough meaning like sometimes I just don't know what to think.
Well, I don't expect you to know. I just expect you to think about it.
Right.
To really think about that. What is that? I'm guiding you right now. That's all this is. I don't expect you to know this. If you knew this stuff, I'd be hiring you to start teaching people this. I'd be like, can you assist me writing this book?
All right, so ask me a question again so I can think about it without laughing.
Okay, see, now I got to pull it back up. Hold on.
Okay. I know it was, what should I be doing differently, or what do I need?
What are you trying to cover up? Or what isn't being
met?
Yes. What are you not doing that alcohol would do for you? Alcohol really is just grace juice. I call it Jesus juice. No, that's what drugs do. They are grace. They are forgiveness. They give you lenience. They are providing you compassion.
Yeah.
That's all it does.
It was my way of not having to think about things.
Well, because it's giving you compassion. You don't have to feel like a failure. You don't need it. You're okay in that moment. So what is the problem? What is it that makes you need compassion from liquid beverage?
That maybe it's easier than thinking about it.
Well, the goal would be that you have it within yourself. You know how the other day when we talked about your dad, and I was like, you got to have compassion. You got to look at it from a different position. You got to surrender your victim story to look at it from a place where he is forgivable. Like, this is so forgivable, and you're going to do it without him asking for it. Right. It really comes down to being responsible. If you don't have something outside of yourself to feel better about your shame, feelings of inadequacy, feelings of failure, Don't you agree? You're going to have to look at why you feel like a failure. I'm going to come back to myself again. And again, this all came to me in this one out-of-body near-death experience. The only reason I carried so much horrible shame was because of the religion. Well, because the religion became so identifying. The rules became defining. Following the rules was defining, and not following the rules were defining. So my shame came from having sex before marriage. And so in that religion, there's no context, it's okay. There is no context where it's forgivable. It is a sin. Black, white, all nothing. So it was the radicalism in that, the way I was taught. Okay, the way I was taught that way. And that could not be the religion. It could have been my own parents' fear that taught it me that way, So that's why I had shame. It was because the standard that I had failed was out of reality. It was only easy if you removed yourself from reality. You had to stay in isolation. So when I left isolation, I held myself to an isolation's standard. So I had to recognize that because I was so weak, immature, had absolutely no discernment, I became an easy target. And because I was also taught to obey at all times, very authoritarian obedience was very, very important. I never really learned to have a voice, to say no. You never make other people uncomfortable. Ever. Don't ever speak up. Don't ever make anybody uncomfortable. So I'm in a position where I do not want to have sex and I can't talk. I have no voice. I am basically being choked by the religion in the moment, not realizing it. And I took all the blame. So I really had to actually take that blame and move it. Who's to blame? Who's to blame? And that's not necessarily a good thing to do, but I realized that what's to blame isn't me. Not so much. It was the strictness and the radicalism that I was taught that's to blame. It was like a bunch of things, right? So you have to look at your radical belief systems that are why you feel bad about yourself. What are the systems in place that are fundamental to how you identify yourself, where you feel you are failing at? Clearly, we know the body image is a major one. Only thin people are valuable. So fat people are not valuable. And now that you're fat, you're not valuable, right? So that's a big source of shame for pretty much everybody with an eating disorder. Everyone. Right?
Yeah.
So you really have to look at those sources of shame. Do you have any obvious ones?
I don't know.
You talked about drinking alcohol. Do you have shame around that?
I guess I did when I was like hiding it from people. I mean, I was drinking pretty good every day and hiding it. Nobody would have known. I mean, people would tease and say, "Oh, she loves her wine."
Yeah, but they didn't know the depth of it. Yeah.
And it's so socially acceptable. You're almost a freak if you don't drink.
Yeah, it's kind of like a freak if you don't diet.
Right.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and the difference is you were using it for a reason that they didn't know about. It wasn't just the enjoyment and the pleasure and the taste of wine. It was, I need to medicate.
Right.
Feelings of shame. They didn't know the shame that you had underneath it all, right?
Right, because if they knew, then I wouldn't have to hide it.
Correct. Yeah. Well, and then the shame builds because you feel bad about what you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Again, there's no compassion. Let's look at it with compassion. Someone with that type of shame, they'd be stupid not to drink. You're dumb if you don't medicate it. I mean, look at it from that position.
Yeah.
Who feels that dark and demented and refuses to get aid? You know, that's what that alcohol represented to you. It's no different than someone who feels that dark and crazy. This is how I was with my body image. Why wouldn't I exercise for 2 hours? It would have been dumb for me not to exercise for 2 hours. That, you know, that exercise gave me a sense of relief. It gave me one moment of air. Oh, I can breathe for 2 seconds. Why wouldn't you do that? You know, have compassion for people who impulsively shop. Think of what it takes for someone to do that, or gambling. There's sense in it, right?
Well, tell me what the sense is, because I kind of feel like I'm out of control right now with spending, and I mean it's not out of control, but I feel out of control. Like I have it
feels
like
similar to
my
drinking.
House or,
got it.
You know, maxed out my credit cards, but I just feel like.
Got it. It's impulsive.
Right.
So look at what you're trying to feel better about. I mean, look at from it. Give yourself some distance from it. Think of the feelings that you're getting and how they're supplementing what you don't think you have and what you're getting out of that. So would you say let's just take a random stranger, if that's how it felt to them, don't you think they would do it too?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sense in it in relation to the needs that it's fulfilling for you. It's fulfilling a need.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what the need is.
Well, you could look at how you feel inside. Boredom. Do you feel bad about your weight? Let's start with that one.
Right now, no, I don't.
Okay, do you feel bad about your living situation?
No.
How about your marriage?
No.
How about your anything?
Well, I guess I'm feeling a little resentful about my job.
Okay. So is this your way of compensating yourself for the resent? And again, the victim, go to the victim position. Because that's what this is. Mm-hmm. Right? Resent is feeling it's unfair, right? This is unfair.
Yeah.
So are you compensating yourself? Is that what that is? Like, I got to feel rewarded?
It could be. Since I got to work, I'm going to reward myself since I make money and I can choose to do what I want with my money.
Okay, feel it out. Feel it. Does it match? I can't answer this for you.
Right. No, I think it could match.
Well, it would go ding, ding. I'm... Do you have anxiety? Are you anxious?
About going to work?
I don't know. Anything.
I don't think so.
How about the feeling when you choose, I'm going to go to the mall? Like, what do you do? What are you paying for? Are you online? Are you like...
Yeah, it's more online that I just shop. Like, oh, I could use this. And then, well, I'm going to get it because I feel I need it. And I do. And then I have, like, buyer's remorse sometimes. Like, why did I buy that? That was dumb.
Okay, some of this is totally normal. I mean, there's a terminology called buyer's remorse. That I don't think this is that uncommon. You know, you got to look, though, at, like, look at your standards of shopping. Are you typically, like, never shop ever? Are you kind of strict around spending money? Were you extreme around strictness of keeping your money? Is this in...
I was when I was younger.
Okay, so do you feel bad in relation to that? Because this could stem from this idea that people who spend money and buy things are dumb and stupid. So you might be holding yourself to a really high standard. And it's kind of like how people respond to dieting is when they've been restricted and they finally feel I worked my ass off. Why can't I reward myself? They tend to over-reward themselves.
That could be.
Again, I'm just bringing this up. I cannot tell you if this is true or not. I can just say, look at it from this angle. Look at it from this angle. What I'm teaching you right now is this is how you do it. You don't just do it. You look back at what you're doing and why. You go into looking at it rather than just avoiding it and having these feelings of I'm sucky, I'm doing something wrong. Oh my God. No, look at it. Understand it. You know? Again, it's like, do you tell yourself in your mind, I'll just get this for now and then I'll stop?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so the stopping comes from an expectation or an idea of limitation, which is, you could say, healthy. There's healthy boundaries. It's no different than saying I shouldn't eat 20 cookies. Well, yeah. But if not eating 20 cookies is very different than feeling bad about eating 2. You see what I'm saying? So are you catastrophizing your spending?
Maybe. It could be.
Well, you tell me. Look at your spending habits. Normally, do you feel more comfortable when you have a deeper savings? Like, this is a really important conversation.
Right. Oh, I know it is, because this is how I'm kind of acting out against, I don't know, who am I acting out against? Myself? Because I took away my diet, now I gotta...
Yeah, could be. I don't get to eat. So I'm a victim because I'm not binging anymore and I'm not eating and I'm not drinking. What can I do to get that same excitement or fun, something to do when I'm bored? Again, it's not taking responsibility for doing something. I mean, I guess you are taking responsibility. You're just giving the responsibility away to consumerism. Consumption. Maybe what you need to do before you buy something. I've got an anthropology app on my phone, and I just look at it like window shopping all the time. I fill the cart and then I delete, because I can't afford it. I can't afford any of it,
Because anthropology is super expensive.
Yeah, it is. But it's so fun. It's like a nester's crack house. It's like taking cocaine for someone nesting. So I window shop. But I just don't buy anything unless it's like amazing and on clearance,
Yeah, right. That's funny.
Are you not taking into account are you doing your accounting? So maybe the issue is spending without really understanding your budget.
Yeah, that could be. Well, my income has changed too, so maybe I'm just thinking I'm still at the higher income and haven't really adjusted down yet to a smaller income either. So
that could be.
Which it's not good either, but.
Yeah, but I don't know. Again, look at are you going into debt?
No, but I feel like if I keep up at this rate, I might go into debt.
So here's some good news. You're aware of that.
Yeah, it's true.
So why don't you take some time then in this spending habit or spending that you're doing to just sit in that space and try to understand why you're gravitating to it. Is it just boredom?
Could be.
You could also just say, I'm done. I don't need anything. I need nothing. It's kind of like going on, I do not want to say a diet, but it's like eating to hunger. You're going to spend to need, You pick and choose those rewards. I actually feel very similar. I was raised, when I grew up, we were very poor. I mean, 10 children. Granted, it was the 1970s and 80s, so it was way cheaper to live. On my dad's Air Force salary, I remember when we lived in Alaska, couldn't afford fruit, so we took vitamin C tablets. And then we also, for a short period of time, couldn't afford milk, so we drank powdered milk. I remember the taste so well. So weird. I just remember it so well in this big brown Tupperware pitcher, mixing up the milk. Anyways, and I grew up wearing hand-me-downs. I'm number 9 of 10 children, and so my sisters that went through high school, I have one sister in particular who I'm 5'9", and she's 5'10", so I only really fit in her clothes. And I have size 10 feet, so I only fit in her shoes. So I always had her hand-me-downs, which were cool about 5 years earlier. So I always looked dumpy, old clothes, and
Out of style, right?
oh, so out of style. I was wearing these 80s high heels that had broken heels, you know, with the nail poking out the heel in the early 1990s. You know, it was just like my sister Katie, the youngest, used to make fun of me. But she was a smaller size and fit into different clothes. So anyway, the same type of like wanting to get new clothes, wanting to reward myself with the freedom to even just get new clothes. New clothes has that sparkle, right? Because to me it was like something I didn't have, lacking. It came from a state of lacking as a child, even though I wasn't super reliant on being the coolest with my clothes and whatnot. It wasn't important to me. It still felt lacking. So that's something to look at. Where have you been lacking? And I think what you brought up might be it. It might be that, well, I have my salary is less, so you might feel the pinch in the freedom of spending, which might be promoting the pressure to spend. Which is kind of like the feast before the famine. Did it?
I think that's it.
Ding, 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 ding. It's kind of like, oh shit, there's a famine coming. I should spend as much money as I can. But so what you need to do is really question, am I really lacking? Did I really need that large of a salary? It was kind of cushy, you could say. Gave me a lot of cushion.
Oh, yeah, and that was a choice that I made. I made a choice to cut down my hours because I just felt like I was drowning and I think that was when I was drinking more.
Got it.
I just couldn't cope with the stress of working full-time for all those years and being miserable at my job, and I chose to take up less money in order to save my sanity.
Yeah. So the other thing, too, to look at is, I'm sorry, the sun is shining in all the wrong places in this recording. So I got to shift over here. The other thing to look at as well is at the time that you were kind of losing your shit, you were also focused. You also had an eating disorder. Again, keep in mind how dark and horrible that is, because you're supposed to starve yourself at the same time that you're actually working like that, which makes it even more insane. And when you're starving yourself like that, it makes you highly vulnerable to stress. Right? So add all that together and look at your work decision, which made sense with like juggling 5 balls on fire, one of which is like razor blades, which would be the dieting one. Why you would say, I gotta reduce my work output. So at this point, do you feel bored without the work?
No.
Okay, well that's good. So the decision, so the decision to cut your work in half was a good decision.
Oh my God, yeah.
Even without the dieting and the mental illness and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe you need to find something productive that really makes you feel good, that isn't like intrinsically. Big difference. Extrinsic would be the spending. Intrinsic would be like, I'm going to volunteer at a dog shelter, That would be like my thing. Helping animals, being with animals. The weird dog lady. You know what I mean? Find something that really brings you like passion. That could be something. Do you have something of passion? Because again, your passion and devotion was surviving with your thin supremacy and dieting before, and then the binging as a form of like explosive, compensation, and we got rid of that. It kind of, I remember it feeling dull after recovery. It was dull but illuminated. I mean, it's like I was high as a kite on love for whatever reason for years, but it was dull. It was Say that again?
It took up a lot of time, so it's almost like, now what? Now what do I do to fill the time?
Yeah, but don't forget the excitement and the energy when you decide to binge. That's like, it's like explosive. And there's a lot you get out of that. And you give that up too, but for good reason. I mean, you're miserable. You're in a dark hell. So it's worth getting rid of, but it fills up a lot of energy and excitement in a secret way, So I wonder if in your life there's enough pleasure. That's something else to look at besides, feeling the pinch of, oh my God, I don't have as much money. I should spend it all.
So stupid though.
Yeah, but I think it's somewhat natural, right? It's like feast before famine. Again, to me, it's very primal oriented. So don't judge it. It's just when you really sit back and think about it, it's absolutely irrational. It's coming from an emotional state, not an intellectual thing, right? So the next thing I would suggest you look at is there enough joy in your existence? Again, is joy coming outside of you or is it coming from within you? So for me, I knew I had no joy in my life, and without religion, I was left with nothing. So I had to create everything. And so going into what brings me joy, like when we talked about what's your favorite color, that brings me joy. This color brings me joy in the moment. Well, I like to do this. I like to read about this. These things are interesting to me. Reading this type of book is interesting to me. Taking my dogs for a walk. Those are things that I do because I enjoy them. I actually really love decorating. I enjoy nesting. I don't know. Just look at the big picture. It could be just that one thing. It just could be you having a moment to just relax around a reduced salary. And also recognize that it is, there's terminology around this. It is just a relative deprivation. It's not real deprivation. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
I'm not sure.
Let me give you an example.
Okay.
So imagine you just graduated from college, and you get offered a job out of college, which is at this point not common. And so it's amazing that you got a job offer, and it's got a 401k, and it gives you retirement and blah, blah, blah. And it's like $40,000 a year. Okay? To a college graduate, that is a big deal. So that college graduate works and they get promoted. They get $45,000. They get promoted. They get $50,000. They get a new job. It's $60,000 within 5 years. So within 5 years of graduating from college, they're making $65,000, $80,000 a year. Okay. So the new job they took is in an industry that's not doing well anymore, and he loses his job. Okay. So now he goes back in the market, and he's really not worth $80,000. He's worth $55,000 to $60,000. How do you think it feels to go back to reality in the work that he's in, getting paid the actual reality of what he's worth, which is between $50,000 and $60,000, and no longer making $80,000?
You must feel rejected,
It's called relative deprivation. It's all relative to what you expect. So as you have rising expectations, you're more likely to have relative deprivation, which means you're never really satisfied because there's rising expectations. No one really ever expects that as you work, that you might get a job cut, job loss. No one's expecting that. We're always taught it just goes straight up. So when you latch on, when the person latches on to 80,000 as the new zero, instead of it being like, you're really fortunate, you're making way more than you should probably save that extra money because it's not going to last very long. Like they're becoming arrogant about it and attaching it to a zero and making it zero. Like this is expected. Okay, that's really important because once you latch on to an expectation, you become less lenient, less graceful, right? Because it is now expected. So you adapt your mind around that expectation. So if you lose a job and you are now making, 55,000, before it would have been like totally acceptable, something that was within that range. It's really relative. Do you see that? It's relative. You're not really being deprived. The fact that he's got a job and it's paying that amount of money is right around what it's worth to have that type of trade, But because the person attached to 80 grand a year, he feels bad about it. So it's like a real distortion that has no gratitude, right? And no grace around it. And so that's something you might be experiencing too, is a relative deprivation. So there's the expectation of a certain salary, even if you knew, I don't want to work that hard anymore, it's not worth that type of money, you might still be holding yourself to that type of reward system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but it's got to feel right, like the ding, 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 that's it.
It's dinging on the inside.
Okay. So that's something to look at too, which may be, your spending may be your way of compensating or feeling compensated for feeling deprived from the income, even though you are deprived of the output. You're no longer putting out as much effort, right? So you might have to lower your standards in your mind around expectation and adjust your reward system to that. Well, the goal is that you always are grateful. Again, gratitude, always. So even with this type of thought training I do with people around the HCG protocol, because if they end up doing it, the goal is that they have the ability to create relative gratitude, relative abundance. This is abundant. How do you make everything feel abundant even when there's a $30,000 salary change, How do you make that feel abundant? Well, you keep your expectation or 0 point at 0. You don't make it plus 50.
Yeah, where it was when you had more income.
Yeah, I set my 0 point at living on a tent on the side of the mountain with myself. I'm not kidding. Like, I could live in a 900 square foot apartment with all of my kids and 2 dogs. I could handle that. That's still better than a lot of people. That's a first world problem. So my relative point of deprivation is in the negatives. It's not above negative, right? I try to make sure it's always relative to real sacrifice and suffering. The materialism is all benefit. Everything I have here is a benefit. This is way more than I actually need. So I'm always living in abundance. What it takes for me to go into deprivation is absolute negativity. Loss to me is only loss relative to what I can handle. So maybe that's what you need to do, is kind of recalibrate what you can handle financially. Like, go into your own mind in terms of a salary where you're like, I cannot go below this point because I can't afford food. I can't afford my rent. I can't afford my mortgage. I can't afford my car payment. I can't afford gas. Maybe you need to actually get a calculated 0 point for yourself where this is what I need to do. And then everything else is really abundant. Now, that's not like saying, well, now you have all the freedom to go binge on spending. Well, of course not. But if you feel abundant, you shouldn't want that binge. It's when you feel deprived that you compensate. It's when I feel deprived, I am losing out. I deserve to shop. I deserve a reward, right? So you see how that goes hand in hand? Yeah. All right. Let's be done.